Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz and I'm joined by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he's trying to figure out who eats more in a fight between World Gorger Dragon and Coma World Eater. It's Matt Morgan.
So I was recently at dinner, we were celebrating a couple friends, and we were all giving toasts. So I asked, could I say a word? And they said, of course. So I stood up and said, plethora. And crying, my friend said, thank you so much. That means a lot.
It does mean a lot. Matt, as ever, your dad jokes are thoroughly punishing.
I agree. I got so exuberant with the chancements of I'm done here. I only know like two big words. Gotcha.
All right. Up next, he doesn't know who wins in a fight between those world eaters. He just really hopes that they don't eat his old cards that have the type world enchantment. It's Dana Roach.
This show will go out on Black Friday, so I would just like to request that anyone out there at a store trying to get some deals, please be responsible and civil and act like a professional and hold your camera vertically when you record any fights like this, that when you get the full scope of what's happening, don't be trying to hold it incorrectly so we miss what's happening. Get the full frame and just be an adult about it, please.
That took a turn. Kind of like the turn you should take with your camera, apparently, to capture all the action.
Yeah.
Wow, Dana. Absolutely wow. I feel
Dana's showing his age too, because like, when was the last time anybody went to a physical store on Black Friday?
Right, exactly.
It was all digital.
That's a really fair point.
That's so true. We need to get an alt of Disrupt Decorum, but with like Black Friday video as the art instead.
People buying TVs at Best Buy.
All right. Matt, what are we talking about in this week's episode, dude?
So this week we're going to talk about when support cards are actually kind of the stars of a deck, and how sometimes even support cards are more important than maybe some of the theme cards that the deck is built around.
Yeah, when you're building around any strategy, is the actual payoff of that strategy, the entire theme of that strategy, really the star of the deck, or is it what makes that stuff possible in the first place? I'm really excited that you put this idea forward. I'm excited to talk about it with you. There are a couple of things I want to let folks know about before we get into our main show, though.
This week's show is brought to you by Cardsphere. When we get a new set once a month, getting cards for your decks becomes a kind of complicated and never-ending task. And Cardsphere lets you send the cards you're not using to people for credit to use to pick up the cards that you do want for your decks.
Yeah, Cardsphere has made it easy for even me to keep updating my decks. I just throw a little bit of money in there onto my account and just watch cards come in. I am able to set the limits that I like to use and however much I want to be paying for cards. And it's just a fantastic way to make sure I'm gradually getting cards, reminding myself that, oh yeah, I do need to update these decks.
Yeah, and it's nice too that you don't ever have to put any money into it. You can just get credit by trading. And it's nice in a time where I feel like I don't trade much in person anymore. It's cool to have that accessible to me online. And I've gotten some really spicy stuff this way.
Yeah, having a network of traders all over the world, it does really make it easy. You're always going to have options. And Cardsphere has just been absolutely fantastic.
Just head over to cardsphere.com to set up an account today. It's really easy to use, it's easy to set up, and it's easy to get trading.
And if you would like to support the show, you can do so in a lot of different ways. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, liking this video, subscribing to your local podcast app, leaving a review over there. Great free ways to support the show, which we definitely appreciate. But if you are so moved, you can go over to patreon.com/EDHRECast, where we have patron tiers of all sorts of levels. Whether you want to submit challenges stats, we have a specific channel for that in our Discord community. You can see all of our historic challenges as well. You can join our Discord there at a certain level too. There's so many different levels, just a nice way to get yourself a little something in return for supporting us financially, including the tier where you're in the running to be the patron of the week. And we give a very special shout out every single week. So this week we want to give a very special shout out to Mavo Frazier, who it's very cool that your uncle had that show about being in Seattle, having a radio show, all that stuff. And it's even making a comeback. So Mavo, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for the sitcom as well. Hope things are going well for you up in Seattle town.
Hey, as a Seattleite myself, I 100% approve. All right, guys, let's get into our main topic here. Matt, as you said, we're talking about support cards and how sometimes they're the true all-stars of a commander deck. What got you thinking about this topic in the first place? Why are we here talking about it? Where do we get started?
Well, if anybody is surprised, I'm going to surprise you here. I built a new deck, or I'm building a new deck, I should say. It's currently in the process of getting the cards together, but I bought 30 Heir Apparents. And that deck has been a lot of fun to brew around with. It's a deck all about that new card where when it enters the battlefield, you make a whole bunch of rabbit tokens, and you can have any Heir Apparents, any number of Heir Apparents as you want in the deck, kind of the Shadowborn Apostle type of thing, Slime Against Humanity, all those types of cards. We finally got a fun one in white to build around, so I did. And one thing I noticed as I'm building the deck is that the strategy so much isn't about how many Heir Apparents can I get out, which is, it's very important. But eventually you kind of need something to do with all those hairs. And that's when I found myself realizing that the support cards for this specific deck actually are probably more important than just drawing the hairs.
Yeah, I definitely identify with that, Matt. At a certain point, the hairs themselves are like, they're doing what they're doing, but they're always doing that exact same thing. And it's much more the rest of the deck, the accoutrement around them, the nervous system of the deck that actually allows them to facilitate that strategy in the first place. I'm looking over your list and you've got cards in there like Remembrance, which allows you to pull multiple Heir Apparents back from the graveyard. And like that allows them to do the thing even better. You've got an Allurin in here, which is a very classic U card, but it also gives those Heir Apparents the ability to be cast with flash, and you can play them for free, which also just greases the wheels of that strategy so much more. I love that you've got Raise the Past in here, which will help bring them all back out of the graveyard. You've got a card I don't think I've even heard of before called Nantuko Shrine in here. I feel like I'm not as worried about the Heir Apparents in your deck. I'm worried about these other cards that are decorating the strategy.
Well, yeah, so the support cards here, it's not even the fact that like they're just very good support cards. They're cards that you don't get to play in literally any other deck, so I'm excited to play them for that. But yeah, Nantuko Shrine is super fun because board wipes happen. Removal happens in Commander. That's just what the format is about. So having some way to actually have some backup and some support as you're rebuilding your battlefield. Nantuko Shrine, Joey, since you don't know, and I'm guessing our listeners probably don't know, because there's no reason to play it in a lot of Commander decks. It's 1 green for an enchantment from Odyssey. You're welcome, Dana. And it says whenever a player plays a spell, that player puts X 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens into play, where X is the number of cards in all graveyards with the same name as that spell. So if I have 5 Heir Apparents in the graveyard, I can cast another Heir Apparent that I top deck, and I'm going to create 5 1/1s.
That's so rad.
And that's just such an amazing way to reestablish the battlefield after a board wipe or anything like that. Or you, Joey, you pointed out Remembrance, another fantastic card that just makes sure if a board wipe does happen, I get to refill my hand and just draw that many Heir Apparents again.
Yeah, Joey likes to talk about Reanimator, and I was going to try to find a example that wasn't Reanimator to use here, but Reanimator's the best example. Like, I couldn't come up with a better thing to talk about. Years ago, I remember watching a deck building stream where someone was building a Muldrotha deck, and the first thing they started talking about after, putting the commander on the screen was, okay, we want to grab a Reanimate, we want to put an Animate Dead in here. And those are useful in a Reanimator deck, even though Muldrotha does those things. But in my mind, I remember thinking, I would much rather concern myself with how I'm going to put things in the graveyard to reanimate them, right, than I am something that's a good card, but is doubling up what the commander's already kind of doing to begin with. Like, Reanimator's just a perfect example. You want to bring things back into play, so how are you going to get them in your graveyard in the first place so you can take advantage of that?
I indeed do quite a lot of Reanimator. And Dana, as you were saying, the most important cards in those decks are not necessarily the reanimation spells or the reanimation targets. At a certain point, all of my 9-drops feel just as interchangeable as all of Matt's Heir Apparents. At a certain point, my Animate Deads and my Necromancies and all of those feel like, yeah, you know what? Kind of any reanimation spell will do. Any creature that I reanimate will probably be a problem, but the most... those are kind of the most malleable part of the deck. But the thing that actually greases the wheels and facilitates the strategy are, for me, in a lot of my decks, stuff like Looters, stuff like Thirst for Knowledge effects that will draw you cards and discard those great big targets into the yard in the first place so that they can actually come back out of the graveyard. And I did some looking over the numbers in my decks. In my Mimeoplasm deck, very classic Reanimator there, I have something like 24 cards that help discard cards or help self-mill me, cards like Malevolent Rumble, for instance, which will look at the top couple cards of your deck and put some into the graveyard, let you keep like a land or whatever, so you can still get your land drops and fill up the yard. I've got about 20 of those same effects in my new Winter Cynical Opportunist deck as well, which is again reanimating things, filling that yard, is the important facet there. And any 9-drop is probably going to be pretty impressive, but I need to actually find a way to get it in there in the first place. And that's why those support cards are the true all-stars.
I think that's a super forgotten about piece of Reanimator decks. It's all about the targets and how you're getting them out. But Buried Alive is played in so many decks because it is so powerful at getting things into the graveyard. And I think that's one reason why I struggle with some of these strategies that Joey likes, is because the support cards aren't glamorous, but you need them. And I just forget to put those need cards in them.
And you can kind of look at this two different ways. There are cards that just do the thing, right? Like Buried Alive just puts stuff into your graveyard that you can reanimate. But I think one of the overlooked portions of support cards are kind of the equivalent of whatever the current mechanic is from a standard set. They usually, like, you know, if it's something that does surveil, there will be a, you know, version of Green Ramp that has a surveil attached to it, or there will be a version of Red's, you know, discard a card, draw 2 cards, impulse draw that has a surveil attached to it, right? A lot of times you can find those things that support what your deck strategy is too. So like, rather than put a draw effect in your deck, you would put your draw effect in the deck that has that thing attached to it that enables what your deck strategy is. And there's a lot of those little cards out there that are easy to overlook because they're kind of draft chaff effects that are built to work in standard, but they're really good in EDH if they are tying into whatever the support mechanism is for your deck strategy.
What I find especially interesting, and Matt, I like your example here of the heir apparent, where like the deck is literally filled with a bunch of the same card. That kind of taps into something that I was talking about in a recent video we had on the channel. I believe I called the video, I Built This Deck Wrong. It was about my new Marina Vendrell Rooms list. And I went over something in that video that I'm calling the semantic satiation of commander decks, or in my head, I also sometimes call it like the abstraction of your commander decks, where something I mentioned earlier, the heir apparents feel interchangeable. Any one of them will do. And that's also how I felt about some of my Reanimator targets. Any 9-drop that I summon is like any one of them will do. Those all...
A 9-drop is a 9-drop, yeah.
Right. It's all going to go crush. Like, it's probably pretty good. And they feel like the stars of the show, but they aren't necessarily the stars of the show. An example I use in that video is Halar, the Fire Fletcher, which cares about kicker cards. It gets +1 counters whenever you cast kicked spells, and then it deals damage to your opponents equal to those +1/+1 counters. And I think that's a strong example of this concept, because the actual kicker spells themselves are not really the thing that facilitates that strategy. And in fact, the kicker spells are kind of interchangeable. Any kicker spell doesn't necessarily matter. Any one will do. And in fact, the cheaper the kicker spell that you cast, kind of the better. They're just the thing that ignites the damage trigger. But the thing that actually makes that strategy really go off is just getting more +1/+1 counters onto Halar in the first place. I think that's a way for us to envision this. Like, what is the goal of the strategy versus what's actually making the strategy work and allowing it to work impressively. And in certain decks, it does feel like you hit that point of, yeah, anything is going to work. People who play Eowyn Shield Maiden, I've heard folks say before, like, I just need to draw any human to trigger my commander. And whatever the human is almost stops mattering.
Sure.
It's almost like they'll become part of such a similar category that those decks that have the Shadowborn Apostasy, the Heir Apparent kind of aspects to them, where those things are all the same, that actually I think is kind of a decent lesson to learn about your commander decks. There is a group of cards in your deck that does have that malleability where they're going to be good no matter what, but it is about how do you actually cause them to do the thing that will matter in the first place. What are the actual linchpins of your strategy? And that's what these support cards really are.
So one of the things we talked about offline here before we started recording was trying to differentiate between what is kind of a support card here and what's a payoff card that's like getting you to the win. So I'll start with you, Matt. Like, how do you separate those two things? What in your mind is a support card versus what is the payoff?
Kind of like what Joey was talking about earlier, how a 9-drop is a 9-drop. To me, payoff cards are almost largely irreplaceable. Not replaceable, maybe interchangeable with each other, I think is a good way to kind of put how I feel about that, where I may not get a Perforos, which is a fantastic payoff card for this type of deck, but I still have a chance to get Impact Tremors or War Leader's Call, which are other cards that are going to deal damage to my opponents when creatures on the battlefield. What's harder to replicate, though, are kind of the support cards, where I think a good way of thinking about them and framing them in my head is they're kind of life jacket cards. They're cards that give my deck buoyancy to be where it needs to be throughout the course of the game. Maybe it's shoring up a weakness. So Nantuko Shrine is a fantastic life jacket card for this type of strategy, just because when you look at it, like, I'm playing a bunch of 2/2s, and yes, I make a bunch of tokens from there, but the deck really needs to have a board presence to be established and keep rolling forward. And ultimately, I'm just making a bunch of 1/1s. I need something to do other than, because 1/1s are pretty easy to kill, easy to chump block, stuff like that. So having a life jacket type of card like the Nantuko Shrine we talked about, like Remembrance, make sure that any inherent weaknesses in the deck that I'm brewing are kind of covered up, and I'm given that safety jacket for when things might go wrong.
I love the replaceability thing that you're mentioning there. I think another metaphor in my head is like, it would be like riding a horse without a saddle. The support cards are the saddle. You probably need the support there, or else that ride, or else that game is probably gonna hurt a little bit. It might be a little bit bumpy, and things may not go the way you want them to.
Yeah, Dana, what about you? So when you're looking at support cards in your deck, do you identify them in a certain way? Because like, I know when we talked about deck categories, I almost always put them in the utility category for me, just to kind of know what I'm looking for. Do you do anything specific with payoffs versus support cards?
So the payoff is generally kind of a concept. So Veil, Candlekeep Sage, and Haunted One is a deck I have. Veil is the commander. The Haunted One is the background enchantment in the deck. The payoff in that deck is I'm going to tap and untap Veil a bunch of times, and the way that Haunted One works is whenever a creatures I control that share a creature type with my commander, whenever my commander's tapped, all those creatures get +2/+0. And it's not limited to once a turn. So like, the more times I can untap Veil, the more I buff all of the other wizards in that deck. So
It's such a cool concept.
So the payoff is that it's tapping my commander repeatedly to make mana that I don't even care if I'm going to use, just so I can untap her and tap her again to buff all of my wizards. That's the payoff. But the support cards that are enabling me to do that are things like Magerite Stone that let me untap a creature, or Thousand Year Elixir, or Thassa's Ire, an enchantment that lets me untap a creature. So those are the support cards in that deck. They are supporting the concept of the payoff, which is buffing all of my creatures. Like, that tends to be how I look at it. If you are, and to be more general, and not talk about a specific deck, if you're playing, say, a +1 counters deck, where your +1 counters, your kind of payoff there is buffing a creature, making it giant, or buffing a bunch of creatures and making them giant. Your support cards are the things that let you get those counters in the creatures in the first place, or double the counters, or whatever it is. So like, I tend to think about it in terms of specific cards that are your support versus your payoff is the kind of general concept.
General concept, reporting for duty. Dana, I think another great example here would be, like, of the three of us, you have a Super Friends deck, which I believe is your Jeru with Eyes Open deck. But Super Friends is an extremely popular archetype out there. I think in that case, that's another place where maybe that line between payoff versus support card can start to feel a little bit muddy, a little bit blurry, perhaps. What do you call the support cards on the deck? Not the Planeswalkers. Those all, to an extent, for you, I imagine, like one Elspeth almost feels like another Elspeth. Any of them ulting is good for you, right? Like, those are kind of...
Right.
That seems fine. So in that case, what do you call the support that allows the strategy to be facilitated in the first place? Is it your ramp? Is it your defenses? Is it your proliferate effects? I think proliferate probably feels like a pretty easy thing to point to and say, that's probably the support for a Planeswalker deck. But for my money, I would actually say the support cards are the creatures you have that defend those Planeswalkers so that they don't die. Matt, going to your life jacket analogy there.
Yeah.
In that particular deck, because it's mostly a token deck, most of the Planeswalkers in the deck are Planeswalkers that generate tokens. Obviously, some of those Elspeth ults are backbreaking for your opponents too, but like,
Indeed.
Generally speaking, I'm just trying to use those Planeswalkers to make a ton of tokens. So the support cards in that particular deck tend to be things that interact with tokens in a positive way. Things like Catherine's Crusade, that, like, let's say, put a bunch of counters on them, or or Anointed Procession that will double up the amount of tokens I'm making. So in that deck, it tends to be, the support cards tend to be things that interact with tokens in a positive way that advance my board state.
Sure, yeah. I think for a lot of Super Friends players out there, though, they're going to be up with Tamios and Jaces and Teferis that make a couple less tokens than your particular brand. And in that case, I think them having the solid defenses is what allows that's sort of the linchpin that allows those strategies to work in the first place as well, right? And that's the kind of thing, hinging off of that life jacket analogy, the replaceability analogy there, Matt. Mm-hmm. I think support cards are not sexy. I think they're just kind of like,
they are not. No.
Yeah, they're there. They're facilitating the strategy, and they don't look flashy. But without them, the deck would fall apart. My thirst for knowledge does not look like the most important thing. My Merfolk Looters don't look like the most important thing on my field when I'm playing a Reanimator deck. But if they weren't there, I probably wouldn't be able to make anything happen. And if you don't have creatures to defend your Planeswalkers probably aren't going to do anything that game either. And that's where these all-stars actually get to shine.
That's a really good point, because I would wager over the years, whenever I've found myself in a position where a deck that formerly worked really well started not working as well, it was probably almost always a situation where I had, over the course of tweaking it or adding new cards, pulled out too many of those unsexy support cards to add in some flashy new thing. Mm-hmm. And over the course of doing that multiple times, found my deck not working the way it is, because I pulled out those boring uncommons that enabled what I was doing to replace them with this cool new thing.
Right.
That was a cool new thing, but made my deck not function as well as it did previously.
Well, and it's super easy to kind of get caught up in, we talk about how you should eat your veggies in your deck, and you need to make sure that you're putting those things that, they're kind of required to have a healthy functioning deck that grows and gets to be a big kid. But you need your ramp package, you need ways to draw cards, you need support cards, you need these things that are going to maybe not glamorously fuel everything, but I mean, it like we pointed out earlier, it's very, very hard to reanimate something if they never get to the graveyard to begin with. Mm-hmm. You need those ways to feed into the strategy that makes sure you get to move forward. And so if things do happen to go sideways, what are you going to do? And most oftentimes it's those support cards, it's those random cards that, like Dana said, this isn't like something I'm going to brag about getting to cast, but I'm also going to appreciate getting to cast when I do.
Underwhelming cards in your deck can actually be the most overwhelmingly important cards in the deck. Mm-hmm. I play a lot of Aristocrats, for instance. I need fodder to sacrifice to have my Blood Artists and Bastion of Remembrances trigger in the first place. The deck cannot be all Bastion of Remembrances. Well, guys, I'm loving this. We've tackled some really broad concepts with this, and I'm loving the discussion. I think in part 2 of the show, we'll probably anchor some of this discussion down to some more specific examples. That way we can help people recognize even more of these support cards and how to identify their usefulness and how not to cut them. But for now, I think we're going to pause and challenge the stats, because we can't go too long without challenging the data on EDHREC. There's so much of it, but we don't always agree with it. So let's take a quick break for challenge the stats before we get back into some more examples.
This week's episode is brought to you by TCGplayer.com and their Cyber Weekend promotion. TCG Player is bringing together all of your favorite trading card games into one place. Whether you play Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Disney Lorcana, or any of the other dozens of titles, TCGplayer.com has you covered. This weekend is Cyber Weekend over at TCG Player, so there's never been a better time to get some store credit back on all of your purchases over on the site. From November 29th to December 2nd, all users will get at least 10% back in store credit, and subscribers will get 13% or more back. It sounds like it's time for me to finally get around to finishing some decks. So make sure to check out TCGplayer.com for all of your trading card game needs. Cyber Weekend ends December 2nd, so don't wait to reward yourself with this promotion.
So our listener challenge this week was submitted by a longtime listener and a friend of the podcast, Andy Fleury. Andy, hello from all of us, and hopefully we will see Andy as well as a lot of our listeners here at the upcoming MagicCon Chicago end of February. Andy writes, longtime listener, first-time submitter. I just put together an Alesha Who Laughs at Fate deck, and I was looking for some ways to pump Alesha that doesn't feel like a wasted slot in the deck. And Alesha Who Laughs at Fate is a 3-mana commander, a human warrior for 1 black and a red with first strike. Whenever Alesha attacks, put a +1 counter on it. But most importantly here, it has raid. And it says, at the beginning of your end step, if you attacked this turn, return target creature card with mana value less than or equal to Alesha's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. And Alesha is a 2/2. Now, Andy writes, he's looking for ways to pump Alesha that don't feel like a wasted slot, and the Iron Crag shows up in Voltron commander decks quite frequently, but is not showing up in any Alesha lists. The Iron Crag is a mana rock that can turn into an equipment if you need it to buff your commander. You don't have to pump Alesha very much to have her raid trigger safely fire off and let you kind of attack recklessly. But if you don't need it because you have, either a bunch of counters on it or don't have a creature with a power level that you need to get over the top of, it's still there available for you to use as a mana rock. It's just a really good card, I think, in a lot of different decks, beyond even just Voltron lists. If you have a commander that's like vulnerable to being killed by incidental chip damage or something, it's really nice to have that available as an option as well. It probably should just see more play in general, but this is definitely a good deck for it, and that's a good suggestion, Andy. We like that card a lot and like this deck a lot.
Yeah, what a cool mana rock that becomes something else. And it's one of those things that I keep looking for a place for it, and I think this is a great home. Thank you so much for the challenge, Andy. I'll move to my challenge stats here now. I want to talk about Bloomborough. I want to talk about Ms. Bumbleflower, the Bant Group Hug commander that came out with the Bloomborough precons. She's very popular, 7,600 decks to her name. She is the 4-mana 1/5 Rabbit Citizen with Vigilance and says, whenever you cast a spell, target opponent draws a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That creature gains flying until end of turn, but if this is the second time that this ability has resolved this turn, you draw 2 cards. I like this take on Group Hug a lot. It kind of forces you to be a little bit more proactive. But I gotta say, I'm surprised by some of the cards that are not showing up on Miss Bumbleflower's EDHREC page. The challenge that I'm going to put forward here is Kroos Defense Contractor, although I'll also give an honorable mention to the card Generous Patron. Both of those care about putting counters on your opponent's creatures. Kroos specifically says that it will put shield counters on creatures your opponents control, but also whenever you put one or more counters on a creature you don't control, you tap that creature and goad it, and it gains trample until your next turn. If you're playing Group Hug and you're going to offer those +1 counters to anyone else, you can force those creatures to not be a problem for you. And you don't have to make deals with opponents to see if they might be willing to attack other people. You can goad it and just force that issue. And Generous Patron says whenever you put counters on creatures you don't control, you'll draw a card for putting the counters there. Both of these show up in fewer than 700 Miss Bumbleflower decks, but I think they would be clutch in a deck like this. Bumbleflower is up to a lot of weird, wily nonsense. I like her a lot, and I think that these would be really cool cards to help keep interesting creatures off your back or to help draw you even more cards. They are generous in really deadly ways for that deck, and I definitely recommend giving them a shot if you're going to try out something as nebulous as Group Hug.
Well, I'm going to do the opposite of Group Hug. I'm going to talk about Rakdos the Muscle decks, which definitely are not hugging anybody. So Rakdos the Muscle decks are great. They're all about sacrificing things to exile creature or exile cards and be able to cast them from exile. A card that I've only seen once in Rakdos the Muscle decks that isn't showing up very often according to the data that I was reminded of in my own deck. I recently was playing the Faldorn Precon deck, and I was reminded that Nalfanshi is just an absolutely nutty card. It's super, super powerful, and it's not getting a lot of love in Rakdos the Muscle decks. So Nalfeshni is 5 and a red for a creature beast demon that's a 4/6 with flying, and it says whenever you cast a spell from exile, you copy it, and you may choose new targets for the copy. If it's a permanent spell, that copy gains haste, and at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice this permanent. So if you're playing this Rakdos the Muscle deck that's just cranking out a ton of cards that you're casting from exile, this is a super, super powerful way to have access to casting cards from exile and then getting additional bonuses from that. I've only seen it once, and it was when I was playing with my good friend Mike Carosa, host of Am I the Bullcast. So if you folks listen to that, you know how entertaining it is. But also, this was not very entertaining because it was scary to watch. Because, oh my gosh, just copying all these spells that you're casting from exile. It's a great way to double down on ETB triggers if you're playing anything that has powerful enter the battlefield abilities, or if you're just playing massive, powerful card advantage spells. This is just a fantastic way to make sure you're getting extra copies of that. Only 28% of Rakdos the Muscle decks are playing this card, and I think that should be significantly higher because it's just such a powerful, powerful upside. We talk about all these different spells like Swarm Intelligence that are making sure you get multiple copies of spells that you're casting. Nalfeshni is just a fantastic way to get that in Rakdos, which you don't normally have a ton of access to.
This card's cracked when you
Absolutely.
see it in play, when you're playing around the Prosperers and the Faldorns, and in this case, the Rakdos. Like, oh, did you steal someone else's Swords to Plowshares? Haha, 2 creatures that you're going to target now.
Yeah.
Copying stuff is always great. When it comes on a beater, that's fantastic too. And when it's bespoke to that specific strategy, that's very, very exciting. If I see this on the battlefield and you're playing a Rakdos deck, I am stricken with terror. Let's just be real. I'm terrified of this card.
It's super, super scary to see on the other side. So if I were to build my own Rakdos the Muscle deck, I would definitely start with this card.
All right, guys, let's get back into our main topic here, talking about support cards. And we've talked about some pretty big concepts here, and especially how some of these support cards can sometimes be a little bit difficult to specifically identify within your deck, probably because some of them are so understated in some situations. I think it will probably be helpful for the back half of this episode for us to talk about some specific examples to help key in on how to anchor this discussion to some of those specificities. That way we can see, like, here are more examples of what these support cards are, and more specifically, what to look for when you're identifying support cards within one's own deck. So, Dana, moving into a couple more examples, what else strikes you about support cards, maybe in decks that you're playing or decks that you're tinkering with or decks that you've seen?
So a good example here for one of my decks, I have an EDHRECast Salvage Splicer deck partnered with Malcolm Kenine Navigator. And EDHRECast, when it comes into play, makes a Phyrexian Golem token. And whenever you sacrifice an artifact, you put a +1 counter on EDHRECast and all golems you control. Malcolm gives me access to blue to run a couple of the other splicers, as well as he makes treasures, which I can sacrifice that then put counters on all of those golems. The support cards in that deck are things that allow me to blink EDHRECast or blink any of the other splicers, the Wing Splicer or the Vital Splicer or whatever it is. The things that when they come into play, they bring a golem with them.
Nice.
So all of my support cards are things like Blur or Essence Flux or Spiritual Shift. Those are all cards that are so boring that I just made up one of those 3 names and you're not even sure which of the 3 I made up. It's Spiritual Shift, by the way. The other 2 are actually real.
Devious.
So, like, I need those cards. Otherwise, I play EDHRECast and I play Wing Splicer and they each make me a golem, and that's fine. But, like, I don't want to make a golem. I want to make 6 golems.
Right.
And the way I do that is to repeatedly blink my commander or blink those golems. And those support cards also double as protection. People go to try to remove EDHRECast, and I have a way to save him from a removal spell by blinking him while also making a golem at the same time. Those are super useful cards. Those are the support cards that make that deck function. They're also really, really easy to want to remove from the deck when, Worldwaker Helm or something comes out. That's a cool mythic from Thunder Junction that I can use to make a copy of my golems every single turn.
Yeah.
It's easy to get caught up in removing those support cards, but, like, those are the things that make that deck get from point A to point B.
I love keying into, like, the boringness of it, Dana, the thing that you've mentioned there, because the support cards, I think, as we mentioned before, they're not particularly, like, the most attractive thing in the deck, and it's easy for you to convince yourself that, like, oh, maybe I'll try out this other really cool new mythic Payoff that just came out. I think that happens to us plenty of times in decks. I think we've probably all been in cases where we're, like, I don't know, playing an artifact deck, and you've got so many cards that trigger whenever you cast an artifact, you'll make tokens. Whenever you cast an artifact, you'll draw cards, all of these things, and that leaves you with very little room for the actual artifacts in your deck. But, like, you do need to have some of those Ichor Wellspring-esque cards in your deck for any of those things to actually properly trigger. And so I love that as an example. Those blink spells, they're not great or whatever. And in fact, just looking over your deck list on your Archedeck profile, if someone's taking a look at it, those cards probably feel a little bit flippant or whatever. It's easy to pass over them, to not pay them much heed.
Yeah.
But in the actual game, like you just said, they're protecting your stuff. They're actually one of the most important things you could have in your hand. I'm trying to get rid of your commander, and instead you're blinking it and making more stuff that I have to deal with, and it's only playing into your strategy, and that's perfect. That's exactly what a support card needs to do.
Well, I mean, you're tiptoeing around something that I put in. So specifically, I think Psy Master Thopterist in just artifact decks in general might just be the best support card, because no matter what you're doing with artifacts, you're just making more, whether you need a just mass quantity of them. You're just able to do so many different things with Psy, and I just can't get over it. Like, every time I've looked at different artifact decks, I just keep going back to, okay, well, this deck probably wants a Master Thopterist. If you're making a lot of artifacts, or if you're making big ones, you need to fling them like with a Brea deck, for example. Well, you probably want Master Thopterist. So there's all sorts of just annoyingly good ways, just like you just always want this specific card if you're playing that strategy.
Well, that's actually a good point too, because we've been primarily talking about support cards as a thing that enables your deck's overall strategy, but they don't necessarily have to be. They can just be a thing that generates you a ton of value when your deck is doing the thing it's doing. Like Master Thopterist probably isn't going to be, like, those Thopters aren't probably part of your strategy if you are playing some kind of an equipment deck, but they're free value if you are in that deck, right? If you have Sai in that deck, when you cast those 3 or 4 or 5 swords, your plan isn't to use those Thopters to attack, but they're just accidentally there as blockers or as like alternate things to equip up if you need to.
Well, it's such a safety valve too. Like, yes, if you're playing an equipment deck, okay, I'm probably not going to want to put them onto these Thopters, but then all of a sudden, well, I guess I have these Thopters and there was just a board wipe. So yes, I only have these Thopters, but they still can carry equipment. And it's just a way to just kind of make sure that, no matter what's happening, you're not missing too many beats, at least.
Yeah, I think the fact that they grease a lot of wheels is a really important thing to key in on here. It's not that they are the wheel themselves, and it's not that they make the wheel go even super faster. It can just be that, like, this is going to help sand down a couple of rougher edges that you may not have even noticed were there in the first place.
So I guess an example for me, kind of like the antithesis of what Dana was talking about, is sometimes for me, support cards are the hardest thing to get right, especially when it comes to specific strategies. I think for me, that is why the Aristocrat strategy as a whole has been so hard for me to get right, or at least gets to a place where it does the thing that I see what other people get to do with the strategy. It's so hard for me to find the right ratio of support cards. I don't know why it's Aristocrats specifically. I can't ever get it right. And again, it comes down to the ratios of making sure you have the right payoffs, you have the right fodder, you have all these things, and you have the cards, whether it's, having the right sack outlets, it's having the right amount of things that are just going to, again, grease the wheel. As we've talked about this a lot in our episode that we talked about setups versus payoff cards and all that. And I think support cards very much slides right into that same conversation where in specific strategies, you have to get those numbers right. And I, for some reason, can't get that right.
And especially with certain strategies, you named Aristocrats, it does sometimes feel like you're drawing the wrong half of your deck.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, cool. I've got all of the creatures that I can sacrifice, but no sacrifice outlet. Or, oh, cool, I finally found my sacrifice outlet, but I need to actually get my Blood Artist effects and my other things that will like have the fantastic effects when things die. Or if you get those ratios in the wrong direction, you've got a whole bunch of Blood Artists, but nothing to actually sacrifice in the first place. Or you don't have... And to shore up any one of those things feels like, all right, then I'm eating into how much removal can my deck have? How much ramp can my deck have? So I get why strategies like that are so difficult to find the right ratios in the first place. For my money, equipment decks actually feel that way to me. Unless you're playing Voltron, where you just know for sure that your equipment is 100% just going on your commander. For me, if any type of strategy revolves around having equipment on a couple of different things, there are a couple of Kiris and Nahiris, for instance, that care about having, several equipped creatures. I just feel like, how am I doing this? When do I get the creatures, and when do I get the stuff that enables the equipment, and when do I have the equipment itself, and like, where are they going? That is one that boggles my mind in terms of those ratios and getting those support things down in the first place.
Well, and it's such a tricky balance too, because like Dana, when we were talking before the show, you said, well, sometimes these win conditions, they compound on each other. Everybody needs a Mayhem Devil in those Aristocrats decks to go off, or you need a Zulaport Cutthroat. You don't need or necessarily want, in a lot of situations, multiple of these support cards on the battlefield. You want one for sure, but you may not necessarily want multiples, which is what I think separates the support cards from payoff cards. Payoff cards, you can have more and more of them, and they build on each other. Whereas support cards, you only ever really want one, otherwise they kind of nullify each other's effects.
Yeah, I mean, if I have 4 of those blink effects in my hand, I'm probably not going to want that, right? Like I want to have one at the opportune moment to blink my itch technique, but I don't want to have 4 of those in hand. Whereas when it's a true payoff effect, like the Aristocrats thing you mentioned, those all stack. You are perfectly comfortable having 3 of those or 4 of those things in play, because it's just going to be 3 or 4 times as much damage that you're dealing to people. And we have oftentimes harped on how useful it is to just get reps of the deck. And I think this is a perfect example of that. Like, there's so many times when you brew your list and look at it and like, I have this figured out. But you go play it and you're like, man, I've drawn this card 4 times and I never want to cast it. I think I would want, you would think I would want to. It looks great when I'm looking at my list in Architect. But in reality, I find my deck, the way it functions, this card is never useful to cast for some weird reason. And or I wish I had 2 of this other thing. Right?
Yeah.
Like, but until you get out there and play it and just grind out those games, you don't see that, I think, a lot of times.
Well, Dana, you say that, and it's kind of funny that you say, you have to get reps in, because that's how the whole observation that sparked this entire episode came to be. I was on Architect, I was using the playtester, figuring out how to do things. Be proud of me, listeners. I was goldfishing a deck. I was only goldfishing like the first 3-4 turns. It was only 4 turns, and then I would restart just to make sure I was getting a few copies of whatever. So just being able to understand what you need when you need it, and just playing games, I'm going to say, not getting reps, but playing games, because I don't want to goldfish any more than I have to.
Now, there's something you guys were dancing on there that, to be honest, I'm not even sure if I have all of the words for it in my head put together just yet. But I notice sometimes when I'm playing a deck, especially if I am goldfishing, if I'm trying to get those reps in, and like there are certain cards that I want the deck to do certain things around there. I want this, Gear deck to be able to populate these really cool tokens the way that I've seen other people's Gear decks do. Or I've seen certain cards that are like fantastic in other people's decks, but they're not necessarily performing that same way in my own deck. I think those moments can be very confusing when we're brewing. I've seen this card do amazing stuff. What's going on with my deck? Why can't it make it work? And I feel like, I guess, honing in on those support cards, that's kind of the reason. Like, those are the things that facilitate the strategy. To circle back around to reanimation as an example, if someone is dipping their toe into reanimation decks, probably the cards that are dominating a lot of their attention are the reanimation spells themselves, or the cards that you are resurrecting. And it might not immediately be obvious how many self-mill and self-discard effects are actually present in the deck. But that is actually the proper thing to pay the most attention to, because that is what allows the strategy to work in the first place. But it's difficult to notice that, because I think what's actually present in our minds is just, well, I saw it work in their deck, why isn't it working in mine? And those individual cards, those individual payoffs, end up taking more of our attention. And that's the distraction that I think we need to unlearn when we're trying to brew and to tune.
That's a really good point, because it's not always readily apparent when you're looking at somebody else's deck what those little support cards do that make that deck function so well. There's plenty of, those blue draw spells that draw you 2 cards and you have to discard 2 cards. And if you aren't really paying attention, you're like, well, I just want to draw the cards. Why am I don't want to discard? I'm cards down then. Well, if you're reanimating, you absolutely do. Forgetting the argument about like whether or not Reliquary Tower is worth a slot or not, you absolutely don't want it in your hand if you're playing a Reanimator deck. You want the opportunity to discard at the end of turn. If you draw, off Rishkar's Expertise or something, and you're sitting at 13, you don't want to hold those 13. You want to pitch a bunch of those creatures so you can reanimate them using whatever effects you have. And unless you've played that deck and are really paying attention, that's not readily apparent.
Well, and I think actually, Dana, you just mentioned like individual draw spells. You're famous for your myriad numbers of Night's Whispers and your Winged Wordses and all those. Mm-hmm. Those are little things that eventually add up in your decks compared to the more big, outlandish Rishkar's Expertise types of cards, which, Matt, I know it's like your favorite card ever. It's a great card, totally with you on that, but it's a lot more ostentatious, right? And if you've only got a couple of those big ostentatious things, that's going to make your deck function very differently than, Dana, your deck will function, where you've got like a dozen small things here and there. And I think the thing that we're trying to pay attention to is the stuff that is understated, those dozen small things here and there. So if something big isn't working in your deck the way you've seen it work in other places, it isn't about the big thing. It's actually about those smaller things that helped grease the wheels in the first place. I think that's what I'm trying to get to. But we have that comparison between like, oh, it worked in their deck, why isn't it working in mine? That's a thing that we can sometimes get hung up on. And I think that this might be a way of like finding your way to... This might be a way to navigate through some of those conflicts and some of those comparisons that can sometimes be the thief of your joy.
Yeah, like Jack said, just getting experience playing that deck and seeing how it actually works in your hands too. Like your playstyle makes a difference. Like some people just play the game in a different way that makes the cards they have in their deck play in a different way. And like maybe you need to find out what works for you that doesn't maybe necessarily work for somebody else or vice versa. What works for them isn't working for you, maybe because of the way you play. And you just need to figure out those like little ins and outs and see what things you can do and what support pieces you can run in your deck that might better enable your play style in addition to like what your deck is doing.
Yeah, ultimately, it is the cruelest mistress to be frustrated. You see your friends playing a certain style of deck that you would like to play, but just ultimately it doesn't work. And that's not going to come down to the support cards at all. That's just personal preference there.
And as we said before, sometimes these things are not readily apparent. But Matt, you know what they really are? They are hair apparent.
Hair apparent. Hairily apparent to some.
I look forward to playing against your hair apparent deck and spotting all of the support cards that you have in play that are the real stars of that show. And hopefully, knowing that they are the real stars of your show, they allow me to prioritize them as the threat on the field, and I will be removing them basically.
Don't do that. I want to play these things for a reason.
All right, guys, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you bringing this topic forward, Matt. But with that, I think we are going to call this episode to a close and ask our listeners out there, what are their favorite support cards in their decks? What are the very interesting, sometimes understated cards that actually facilitate and support the strategy in the first place? Let us know out there. And then I guess we're going to end it here. Matt, if our listeners want to get in touch with us, where is it that they can find you on the onlines?
So you can find me at pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, if you need to check out the best trading platform out there for all of your cards, sending and receiving, check out cardsphere.com.
And you can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me everywhere online at Joseph M. Schultz. And if you want to get a hold of the cast, you can find us everywhere online at EDHRECast, or maybe send us an email with, say, a challenge to stat submission at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.